All right, so let's do this brief lecture on the Electoral College. Okay, so first of all, there was a couple schools of thought that the Founding Fathers instituted the Electoral College because they didn't trust the public or the general man at that time to elect a president. Okay, so they wanted a system in place to correct someone improper being elected. It could certainly do that, right? It's also, though, maybe better an example of federalism and giving power to states to play a role in the electoral process of the president. Okay, the minimum number of electoral votes a state can have is 3. Okay, it's going to be based on 2 senators and then the number of representatives. Right, so Ohio has 18 electoral votes. It does give more states a play in electing the president. Okay, if we had the general election, you probably wouldn't have candidates campaigning in a lot of the states in the union because they wouldn't need to. They would campaign in highly populated areas where they knew they were going to get millions of votes. So, there are plus and minuses. Certainly, you can win the electoral vote with 270 electoral votes. You need a majority, 270, and you can lose the popular vote. George Bush lost the popular vote. Donald Trump lost the popular vote. Okay, it's happened more frequently recently, and interesting to see if it continues. Okay. So you're actually voting for an elector. If you vote for the Republican candidate and the Republican wins in your state, there are electors that are set aside, a person that is actually going to cast a ballot at the state assembly for that candidate, and then that will be sent to Washington, D.C. to Congress to be counted. Okay. Most of the time, these electors are bound by law to vote for the majority, for the person that wins the majority in that state, even by 1 vote. Okay, some states do split their electoral vote, Maine, Nebraska, I think, but most states it's winner take all. Okay, so there's an example of that. All right, and then you can tell this is an old map, right? So this is, Ohio had 20 here, so this would have been like when I moved back from Puerto Rico. Okay. All right, so there are 538 electoral votes, okay? Because Washington, D.C., the 23rd Amendment gave electoral votes to Washington, D.C. So you need 270 to win. All right. Now, if there's not, we're going to move on here to back to the regular PowerPoint. But if there's not a majority in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives chooses the president, and the vice president is chosen by the Senate. Okay. All right. So looking at presidential power and the growth of it. Okay. Not a huge importance on the exam. George Washington, establishes a lot of precedents, only serving 2 terms, 8 years, until Roosevelt. That was the president, and then he serves 4 years, 4 terms, and then we get the 22nd Amendment. Okay. Washington establishes the cabinet. So this is heads of the executive department are going to serve as kind of informal advisors to the president. Okay, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, and so forth. Washington establishes it. Adams is not a great president. What happens really during Adams' president, ironically, since Thomas Jefferson is his vice president, remember we don't have the 12th Amendment yet, this guy who got second becomes vice president, we see really the growth of political parties and a huge political divide between Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. Jefferson, ironically, who believed a lot in states' power, is going to grow the power of the presidency through this idea that the president has inherent powers that simply belong to the president because he's the president of a sovereign nation. The biggest example of this is he's going to decide that the president has the power to purchase land. And so he purchases Louisiana Territory, doubles the size of the country. Okay. Jackson, who's largely elected by these new voters as the country has expanded. You're not going to get a president from Virginia or Massachusetts. Okay, you're going to get kind of the common man. But he's also going to reward a lot of patronage and reward people that helped him by giving them government jobs. And he truly believes he is the spokesman for the people. So he's going to use his veto a lot. He's going to refuse to enforce Supreme Court ruling. that they said it was unconstitutional for us to remove the Cherokee from their land. And he says, let the Supreme Court enforce that ruling. And so we get the Trail of Tears and all that. So you'll see cartoons, political cartoons of Jackson being portrayed as like a monarchy because of the way that he kind of ran his presidency. Lincoln uses a lot of war powers. He suspends writ of habeas corpus, puts people in jail without basically giving them reason because he's trying to keep the Union together. Really didn't want the border states, to secede from the Union. And so really expands kind of presidential powers during times of war. Then Roosevelt is going to be kind of the quintessential, right, where we're going to see the government grow exponentially. Presidential power grows a lot in times of crisis. And you can't have two bigger crises than the Great Depression and World War II. And he's going to have a lot of influence. People are going to turn to Roosevelt for help. He's going to do his fireside chats and take his message to the American people, right? He's going to threaten to expand the number of judges on the Supreme Court because they keep ruling his laws unconstitutional, okay? And so eventually the country just follows him, right? We get his executive order that interns Japanese Americans. And the Supreme Court backs him up with Korematsu versus the United States. So we see a huge jump in presidential power with FDR. Okay. Again, you can see the same thing with what happened with President Bush in 9/11 as a more modern example. And we get things like the Patriot Act, right? And kind of more spying on the American people. Well, why? Because something awful, catastrophic happened and people don't want it to happen again, or they want it to end, so they're willing to give up more authority to an individual. Okay. All right, the vice president is largely important because he helps balance the ticket. Okay, if you have a presidential candidate from the east, your vice president might be from the west. If you have an older president, you might want a younger vice president. You have a president who's good with the economy, you want a vice president who's good with foreign affairs, right? Barack Obama, young guy, first-term senator, needed an experienced veteran from Washington, D.C. He takes Joe Biden. Okay? They help to balance the ticket. The ticket is the president and the vice president on the ballot. We call that a ticket. Okay? Vice presidents have gotten more responsibilities in recent years by presidents because constitutionally they only have two roles. Hopefully you can name the two roles of the vice president. I'll let you do that now. Did you get it right? But otherwise, they have to rely on the president basically giving them responsibilities with the administration and to oversee certain agencies or programs that the president wants them to be in charge of. Okay? The cabinet, we talked about this already. All the different federal agencies, Secretary of State, Secretary of Education, Agriculture, Transportation, Housing and Urban Development, all of those. Okay? They help to execute the laws and programs of the executive department. It's huge. The biggest branch of government is the executive department, and the president is the boss of them. Okay? The heads of each of those departments serve as the president's cabinet, where he will rely on them for advice in the affairs of government. Some presidents have relied on this cabinet more times than not, right? You've heard of a cabinet meeting, right? But it's informal. Cabinet meetings are not actually in the Constitution. It's just what presidents have used. Okay, really not going to spend a lot of time talking about spouses. Sometimes the president gives them a program to oversee, like a reading program for kids, nutrition program, anti-drug program, so on and so forth. Okay, right. The executive office of the president works directly with the president, reports directly to the president, which originally established because of the New Deal, but now it has a lot more other agencies in it, as you can see there. Maybe the biggest one being the National Security Council. And we'll come back and talk about the Office of Budget and Management and Budget in a while, OMB. Okay. The White House staff, I mentioned these guys already. They don't have to be approved by the Senate. They work directly out of the West Wing. They're the president's closest advisors. A lot of times, personal relationship with the president, the chief of staff, the press secretary, speechwriters, legislative liaisons that work directly with Congress. They help the president put together and package his political message and to get his agenda accomplished, how to reach out to the people, so on and so forth. Okay? But they don't really have any legal authority like Congress does or any of the departments. Pay attention to this part. Not subject to Senate confirmation. Okay. All right, going public. This is important. One of the biggest informal things the president can do is take his message to the people, right? Roosevelt called this his bully pulpit, right? Like a preacher behind a pulpit. He can be on TV. He can do press conferences. all these things. He has a State of the Union address to try to convince the American people to follow him. If Congress isn't doing what he wants, he takes it to the American people. He tries to convince the American people. Okay? And the more persuasive a president can be, the better they'll do usually. And most successful presidents have been very, very good at this, from Reagan, okay, to Clinton, to Obama, to even President Trump. Even though he's maybe a little bit more abrasive about it, he's very effective in trying to go public with his message, okay, to get his supporters of the American people to help him push his agenda through. Okay, it's very important. Remember this term, going public. Remember the term bully pulpit. Okay, let's see here. Same thing, power to persuade, bully pulpit, technology, all that. Okay, approval ratings. These are important. Remember that the president is the head of his party, and if he has high approval ratings, he's going to have members of his party that are going to want him to campaign for him. But this kind of goes up and down for the president. Presidents used to have what they called a honeymoon period, which was the first 100 days in office, where the Congress kind of gave him more of a break, maybe passed some bills that weren't controversial and so forth. The last couple of presidents, President Obama, President Trump, really haven't had a honeymoon period. It's gotten very heated and very political, very polarized very quickly. And so this has become less and less. Okay. Remember that 100 days, the first 100 days, trying to give the president a break, let him get some legislation passed. Not so easy anymore. Okay. All right, so we talked about OMB before, where they put together the budget from the agencies. The president then obviously looks over it with his advisors and sends it to Congress. Congress works through it. The Congressional Budget Office works through it. Congress makes changes to it. They can pass it, then the president has to sign it. We haven't had a regular budget since 1997. Okay, so we keep passing these temporary measures to fund the government, to fund certain programs. That's why we keep shutting down the government. Okay, because we don't have the budget process that's been followed for a long, long, long time. Okay, so the government is responsible for what we call fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is taxing and spending, which is what the president can do with his budget. Okay, where we talk about monetary policy later, that gets into the idea of interest rates and Federal Reserve systems. All right, the one thing that's on here that's very important is executive orders. Executive orders allows the president to try to enforce laws and to get his bureaucratic departments to enforce certain regulations and to interpret things a certain way in order to really carry out his functions as the executive, as the boss. However, this is really expanded over time. This does not require congressional approval. Okay? Executive orders do not require congressional approval. They can, however, be ruled unconstitutional. And a couple of President Trump's executive orders have been. Okay? The other thing is that executive orders can be changed very easily. A new president is elected, he can do another executive order ending the previous executive order. Okay? But they're done more recently because the president can't get Congress to do what he wants them to do, so he tries to issue an executive order to accomplish his agenda. This is probably the most recent way the presidents have tried to expand their power. With the increasing polarization in Congress, it makes political sense that presidents have tried to do this because they can't work together with Congress. Okay. Talked about the OMB, preparing the budget. Executive orders, talked about. Signing statements, I mentioned already too, right? Written comments attached to a bill, what the president really kind of intends to do with the bill and so forth. Okay? All right. Kind of finishing up, let's review the roles of the president. He's the head of state, right? He's the head of the government. He's a symbol of leadership of the country, both for us and for other nations. He's the commander-in-chief of the military, okay? But he is limited by the War Powers Act. He is the chief executive, right? He oversees the executive department. He is their boss in carrying out and enforcement of laws, federal laws. He's the agenda setter, which means he's the chief legislator, right? He pushes his legislative agenda through Congress. He can't introduce bills, but he is very influential in trying to get Congress to pass certain laws. He's the head of the economy, the leader of the economy. Power is limited here, if we remember this act, the Impoundment Act, 73, 74, where the president actually has to spend money that Congress has said he's supposed to spend. If he doesn't want to spend money on a program, he has to get the approval of Congress not to do it, right? Nixon didn't want to spend some money on things that Congress was spending money on and refused the money to allow his departments to spend the money. That's obviously unconstitutional. If Congress appropriates money, it's supposed to be spent. So Congress passes a law to basically reinforce their constitutional power to do that, reducing the power of the president when it comes to economic matters in that area. And the last thing here is that he is the head of his party, right? The leader of his party. All right? Hopefully, you guys have any questions. I think you'll do well in the assessment, but just hit me up if any of this didn't make sense. And hopefully this saves this time, because this is the third time I've done it.